Good afternoon. Welcome to this issue briefing on nuclear brinksmanship. We're going to talk about nuclear weapons. Why are we talking about nuclear weapons now? Right at the beginning of January, in fact, the Foreign Affairs Journal brought out a piece entitled, Are we into the year of living dangerously with nuclear weapons in 2019? And the three examples that they used to illustrate this was the three of the biggest tension areas in geopolitics today: North Korea, Iran, and Russia-US relations. All could be traced back to nuclear weapons issues. It's not just that these issues are linked, but also that there are some events coming up quite soon on the horizon that could bring these events to a crisis. It's just days now until the deadline the US has set for pulling out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty with Russia. The Iran deal continues to exist in a state of crisis and possibly collapse that will become apparent and continue to influence other issues such as US-Europe relations, the conflict in Syria, and more widely. And with North Korea, Chairman Kim Jong-un gave his New Year address almost issuing an ultimatum that unless sanctions were eased, North Korea would pursue a new course. And so we're all thinking in terms of the next summit on what could come out of that in terms of the North Korea issue. But to understand what kind of crisis we might be headed into and how we could avert it, we're joined by two experts coming from different perspectives on nuclear issues, but a lot of experience. First of all, Angela Kane, the senior fellow at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, experience as a senior UN official on political affairs for many years, including disarmament issues. And Bill Burns, the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, with the US government perspective, many years working on Russia issues and disarmament issues, including North Korea. So thank you very much for joining us. Angela, could I begin with you and say, is this talk about crisis exaggerated? Is it alarmist? Or do you think it's justified?
I think it is justified, but let me just say that I'm very happy that the World Economic Forum has put this on the agenda at Davos, because I think it's a perfect example of shaping a new global architecture. I mean, isn't this what we're doing in terms of, are we at a turning point? Are we at an inflection point at this time? And I think that this event is not only of geopolitical significance, but it's also very strongly of an economic significance. Because if you think about the military industry, for example, costs about military expenditures of $1.7 trillion. That's a 2017 figure. And that's really very, very important. But what is the social narrative? Do we want to live in a world where we are threatened of a cloud of increasing nuclear significance? Do we want to deal with the ecological or with the environmental consequences of that? And what has happened is that you have a narrative that is building up, that the US administration is abrogating a lot of the treaties that are either bilateral or that are multilateral. And the INF is one of the architecture, the signature pieces of the arms control, arms limitation agreement. There have always been agreements between the United States and the Russian Federation ever since John F. Kennedy. And so if this treaty is abrogated, that basically means that the only one that is still standing is the New START. And the New START, which is expiring in 2021, it can be extended one time. But one wonders what is actually the possibility of extending it if now the INF treaty is abrogated. There's a 6-month deadline. That 6-month deadline starts on the 2nd of February, and then basically the INF will be no more. Now, what are the distinct advantages of a treaty like the INF, which has been in existence, after all, since 1987. It was negotiated between Reagan and Gorbachev, and it's been one of the bulwark, one of the building blocks of arms limitation and arms control. And what it comes with is not only the treaty itself and the agreements that it made, but also there is a way to manage strategic stability. And that means that you have an insight into what the other side is doing. It's a bilateral treaty, and it only limits the United States and the Russian Federation to these missiles that have a range between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. Now, they're mainly targeted at Europe. And the question is that why do you want to abrogate this treaty now? As you may know, the Russian Federation has made efforts to put this on the agenda, on the international agenda. They have put it forward in the United Nations. They have wanted to discuss it. That has been defeated, both in the First Committee of the General Assembly and in the General Assembly itself. The Russians, both Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov and Foreign Minister Lavrov, have both appealed to the United States to come together. And there was a meeting in Geneva in January, but it did not come with any result. Now, what is the reason why the United States wants to abrogate it? One of the reasons, the main reason, is really that the Russians have violated the INF. They have violated because they have developed a missile that actually exceeds the range that is forbidden by the INF. Now, there have been talks about that this is justified. NATO, for example, has said, yes, we agree with that. Now, these concerns have existed for a long time. They were there under the Obama administration, but they have never been addressed in a satisfactory manner. So there is a commission within the treaty that is an agreement that can meet to discuss these technical issues, but that has not been very successful, and frankly, it has not met very often. The Geneva meeting was the last one, I think, that was had, and beforehand there was a long time nothing. So why would that be abrogated now? In my opinion, the main reason is because there's a restriction of only two countries, and that is Russia and it is the United States. So that means China, Israel, Iran, they can develop these missiles within this range because it only limits Russia and the United States. So maybe the United States, and I'm guessing here, but I'm only extrapolating from what I think might be happening, is that we would like to have missiles that could also be directed against China or against other countries like Iran, like maybe North Korea. We don't know what the rationale is, but there has been a new policy that was passed by the Trump administration also on missiles. And that is very much a policy that is forward-looking in terms of what could happen if you deploy these missiles elsewhere. So rather than limiting the missile deployment to Europe, actually, if you do no longer have an INF, then basically you could deploy them anywhere. So that is something that needs to be kept very much in mind. But if the United States abrogates that treaty on its own, it basically lets the Russian Federation totally off the hook because they are blameless. They've tried to get into a dialogue. They have tried to come back and to say we need to solve these issues. So the question is, why is it that way now? Why do they do it? In my opinion, what needs to be done is you need to work through the issues. And there is a role for other countries to come in here, whether it is NATO, whether it is the international community, whether it is the international community in the Non-Proliferation Treaty context. There needs to be a way to work this out rather than walking away from this treaty with the danger that you also might have a walk away from the New START treaty. And what I see is very important is that you have an architecture that remains because it gives you the insight, it gives you verification, it gives you a host of other benefits that this dialogue creates when you have a treaty that is just in excess of just the sheer numbers and just the sheer effect of the treaty where it actually forbids. And that, to my mind, is something that we really need to keep very much in mind. Let me stop here and come back to some other issues later.
Sure. Well, it's great to be with all of you. It's always a privilege to sit alongside Angela. I think your initial statement, Philip, on 2019 is not an exaggeration. I think in many ways 2019 could be as consequential for nuclear order as any year in more than half a century since the immediate aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where that brush with nuclear Armageddon caused the beginnings of a serious U.S.-Soviet effort at arms control. It helped stimulate the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968. And I say that 2019 could be the most consequential really for three reasons. The three phenomena that I think are at work right now and tend to reinforce one another in a very negative way. The first, as Angela was describing, is the collapse of the old U.S.-Soviet, now U.S.-Russian arms control architecture. I don't think there's much chance at all that the INF Treaty is going to be preserved. It's a long debate about who's responsible. I think the Russians can legitimately be accused of violations of the treaty. I happen to believe, however, that it's better to try to make a flawed treaty work and try to find some way to resolve those issues. But instead, I think both sides are walking away from it now. Angela mentioned the New START agreement, which expires at the beginning of 2021. There's a relatively straightforward way of agreeing if both the US and Russia agree to a simple 5-year extension of that agreement. But at the pace of current events, I think that's also becoming increasingly unlikely. So it's a pretty depressing picture when you look at US-Russia arms control architecture. That depressing picture tends to reinforce a lot of concerns about non-proliferation more widely too, because for better or worse, the United States and Russia have both unique capabilities and unique responsibilities on nuclear issues. And when we're not living up to them, it tends to inspire the worst behavior on the part of other countries. We can talk later about the Iran nuclear issue. I think it was an historic mistake for President Trump to walk away from that agreement. I admire the efforts of our European partners and others to try to preserve it. My guess is that the Iranian regime will try to wait out the Trump administration. But that's not a really sure bet in the sense that you can have inadvertent collisions. You look at the landscape in Syria right now, which is tangled and crowded and contested. As it becomes clear that the economic benefits that the Iranian regime oversold to its people in the first place are not going to be forthcoming. The temptation, especially for the supreme leader in Iran, to walk away from the agreement himself, I think begins to grow over time. North Korea issue is a particular challenge. I've always thought it was a good thing for the United States and North Korea to talk directly to one another, including at the highest level. President Trump got some criticism before the Singapore summit last year for doing that without a lot of advanced preparation, but I couldn't argue that the record of US-North Korea nuclear diplomacy was so pristine before that. It was worth a try. I think the danger has not been, or the risk has not been talking to one another at the highest level. It's been talking past one another and having, to this date at least, a fairly fundamental difference in how you define denuclearization as well. So that's a longer subject as well. And then Angela also mentioned that, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty comes up for a very important review conference in 2020 with not only the Iran and North Korea challenges hanging out there, but a lot of differences amongst the signatories to that treaty. And finally, the third phenomenon that I mentioned is the increasing entanglement of non-nuclear technologies and their advance with nuclear technologies. Cyber is one example. The danger that cyber tools could pose to nuclear command and control, for example. The rapid advances in advanced conventional technologies as well, which are making old concepts of nuclear deterrence much more complicated. And then advances in missile defense technology. President Trump has talked recently about a pretty significant expansion, the biggest expansion in US missile defense technology and expenditure since the Reagan administration. And that tends, in an absence of serious conversations about strategic stability with either the Russians or Chinese, that tends to reinforce their temptation to invest even more actively in offensive nuclear weapons technology as a way to deal with disadvantages in missile defense as well. So any one of those three phenomena would be really complicated to deal with. When you have them intersecting, as it is becoming clear in 2019, that poses a huge test for statesmanship. We ought to be having the kind of serious conversations about strategic stability between the United States and Russia that even in the worst of the Cold War, we managed to have. We ought to have those same conversations between the United States and China right now. And so far, we haven't managed to begin those conversations either. So there's a huge challenge, as I said, for statesmanship out there. And that's a quality that's in pretty short supply, I think, right now, especially coming from the government that I used to work for.
Thank you, Will.
I just wanted to come in here because I wanted to touch on what you started to mention, and that is what I think is also the internal political climate in the United States. It's very toxic right now between the US and Russia. And that's not only because of INF, but it's also because of the invasion of Ukraine, the Crimea, and so forth. So I really wonder, there's no support that I can see for any initiative that would be taken to be more, let's say, reaching out to Russia to say, let us solve these problems. And let me mention one example, which I think is very interesting, because the ABM treaty at one point was also under threat, let's put it that way, because the Soviets at the time had actually put a radar in Siberia, if I remember correctly, that existed for a number of years. And the US did not walk away from the ABM treaty. They basically negotiated, they basically addressed the issue and said, we need to do something about it. And actually that was dismantled at some time, so then it went on. And that is really the way to go. And what I find interesting is that when you have this spiral of upgrading your military that has already started, that's only going to intensify now with an abrogation of the INF. And I have pretty well a feeling it's absolutely going to happen. I think, Bill, you agree with that. And so if that happens, that means that we have a military expenditure spiral that is going on higher and higher and higher. And that, to my mind, is really something that we're here to address in a way. What is the new global architecture? Do we really want to live with that? So then the question comes, what can anyone do to actually abrogate that? And my question to the United States is also, is there the willingness to actually engage in a long, drawn-out process, be it bilateral or be it multilateral, to actually have negotiations, to actually come to an agreement that finds also a 2/3 Senate approval, because I think that is very much a problem right now, that where is the architecture politically to sustain such a process in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'd add is that it is true there's a toxic atmosphere in Washington now about Russian, US-Russian relations. I do think it's fair to say that it has a lot to do with toxic behavior on the part of Putin's Russia in recent years too. So,
yes.
and on the INF treaty, I think it was a clear Russian violation of the treaty that sort of sparked the debate in the US. But I agree with your broad point, Angela. I think, this is one of those moments when, despite the profound differences between the United States and Russia, and we're going to be continuing from the point of view of American policy to manage an adversarial relationship with Russia for some time to come. But as we learned during the Cold War, and I'm not trying to compare these two eras, but even with profound differences between us, it's essential to engage with one another on wider issues of strategic stability, especially because, as I said, those issues are only getting more complicated and more tangled with the revolution in technology.
Thank you. It's quite an intimidating picture that on the one hand you have the nuclear challenge is becoming more complicated, and on the other hand the diplomatic process is becoming more difficult to wield towards a disarmament or control. Before we go out to questions, I just wanted to ask for a brief comment on how you think we avoid crises, either in the case of short-term, country-specific issues like the ones we mentioned, or where will the new actors or moves come from to get those other countries involved in the process to keep moving things in a safer direction, even when some of the key members are reluctant to engage? Angela, would you like?
We both have mentioned already the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the crucible that's coming up. First of all, this year with the last preparatory committee meeting in April, May, and then the next threshold, which is the 50th anniversary of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. No one wants to abrogate that treaty. Everyone wants that to continue. But we already got a rift between member states. And when I was at the UN, I saw that very, very clearly. And it has only intensified since. And that is because the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And that has about half of the ratification needed to come into force. And the attitude of the P5, the 5 recognized nuclear powers in the NPT, has been extremely dismissive. With, I hate to say it, but with the United States being the most abusive in a way for those supporters, towards those supporters of the TPNW, as it's called, or the Nuclear Ban Treaty. And it makes it very difficult to continue in this, because there is an obligation by the P5 to also, I don't even want to talk about negotiate in good sense to disarmament measures, but on the other hand to keep the stability and to keep the NPT in place. And that makes it very, very difficult, because how can you actually argue in favor of the NPT if you see actions like even the nuclear posture review that the US issued last year, which expands the rationale for using a nuclear weapon, which I think was taken very much by surprise to other member states. And I think it is time that other member states come into it here, whether it's the P5, and again, that includes Russia as well. But I think there is a role where a certain statesmanship, as you mentioned, needs to be brought into play, because it cannot be left up to only the US or only the US and Russia. There is a responsibility that's be held by other countries. And again, I mentioned NATO, for example. NATO has been very quiet on this issue. They've agreed with the concerns that have been raised by the US, but they have not really, to my public knowledge in any case, I mean, maybe there are considerations inside, internally, that I'm not privy to, but on the other hand, there is a responsibility by other member states to play a key role and to nudge and to urge and to make this cart go out of the morass that it currently is in. Because there has to be some statesmanship that is being shown. And I must say that so far, I have seen that missing. There is nothing that is coming out of the NPT process in terms of the review conferences that is other than static. It goes according to a certain formula, and it doesn't develop properly. I mean, it does not become dynamic. It does not become cooperative. It goes according to certain schemes. And I hate to say it, but I'm afraid that that's also going to happen in the next conference, which is happening in 3 months' time.
Well, we've certainly picked an uplifting subject for all of you to ruin your digestion after lunch. No, I mean, I would just say 3 things, and it's against the backdrop of the reality that I don't expect any great triumphs in nuclear diplomacy over the next few years. I think what we can do, all of us, is try to manage what is an increasingly fragile situation. I think there are 3 things that would be significant steps in the right direction. In US-Russia terms, it would be to agree on a simple extension of New START for another 5 years. I think, and to begin a conversation about strategic stability that helps draw together all of those fragile issues that I mentioned before. On North Korea, my hope would be that out of the next summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, and hopefully serious negotiations which would unfold beyond that, you begin to make some progress toward freezing and rolling back North Korea's nuclear and missile program. I don't personally think there's any realistic chance that North Korea is going to agree to the total, complete, verifiable denuclearization that remains the formal position of the United States. But it would be no small thing to be able to freeze and roll back that program and apply intrusive verification measures. That would be a significant step forward. Now, ironically, that leads me to my 3rd point, because that would look eerily similar to the initial interim agreement that we made with Iran, which froze and rolled back their nuclear program at the end of 2013. On Iran, my hope would be that the JCPOA, the comprehensive agreement, manages to hold together, over the next couple of years, and that might then create an opportunity for the United States to reconsider its approach to that issue.
Thank you very much to you both. With that, I'd like to open it out to the audience. There's a question in the front here to start with. So if you'd like to mention, introduce yourself briefly and then put your question.
I'm a chairman of Daesun Group, a South Korean company, and also chairman of the World Energy Council. And to my knowledge, I was really surprised to find that the Russian economy is smaller than South Korea in terms of GNP. It's not the superpower in the past, or it is small. And China, the technology not that advanced, but they have huge nuclear capacity. And North Korea its economy is just beyond collapse. So in each country is not threat to, in a way, the global politics. But one of the concerns is that I'm wondering why America is, instead of dividing and rule, it is trying to unite Russia and China and Korea all together with Iran to create huge, formidable, in a way, enemy, and align them against the United States. Why is it doing that way? What is the geopolitical strategy of the United States? Why is the United States moving? It seems to be not very, in a way, not a strategy at all, or whether there is any strategy at all. That's my concern.
Thank you. Bill, would you like to
sure.
tackle that?
No, I mean, I think it's a fair question. You know, I think if you take a step back and look at the international landscape today, the United States is no longer the singular dominant player that we were just after the Cold War. We're still, I would argue, I don't mean this as a statement of American arrogance, the preeminent player. But it's more important than ever for us to work with our allies to build coalitions of countries, whether you're dealing with nuclear issues or you're dealing with Chinese trade and investment practices. It helps to have company and build coalitions of countries and leaderships that share, you know, a lot of our concerns as well. And instead, I think in the current administration, you know, what we've seen is a very strong preference for a kind of muscular unilateralism, which is disdainful of alliances and coalition building and the sorts of things you were suggesting. So it's a very fair question.
Angela, do you have any thoughts on it?
I think that what we have seen is that the United States was always very predictable in terms of its policy, and that goes back to the alliance, backing alliances, continuing the alliances, and also looking for partners while being a preeminent player. And what we have now in the last 2 years is basically a rupture in the continuity of the politics. So there has been a new start, there's been a rule by chaos, if you so want, there's been an abrogation of international agreements. And I will say in the case of North Korea, it has touched something, meaning it has moved something. Whether that's positive or not, I'm hoping, I'm always, you know, being a long-time UN person, I always see the glasses half full rather than half empty, so I'm hoping it's going in that direction. But on the other hand, there are other actions that I think have been highly disruptive, and that was, for example, and I agree with Bill about pulling out of the JCPOA, which is extremely destabilizing, and we haven't seen the end of that. But on the other hand, this is what the situation is, so we have to now see how can we actually deal with that in the terms of the geopolitical situation, and what can others do to actually help this along. And what I think that what everyone is looking to now, it's much more of a focus on where am I in this universe and where are my allies, and South Korea, of course, being a neighbor to North Korea, being in the whole Northeast Asia realm is very much affected by all of this. And that is something that we all need to take into account, but that you need to also take into account in your country as well as the neighboring countries in terms of how can we actually input in this and move it into another situation. Let me mention something, and that is in support of what Bill said, and that is also that it's not only nuclear. The new technologies, the conventional new technologies, cyber, artificial intelligence, you know, drones, you name it, lethal autonomous weapon systems, this all comes into it. And that is part of the strategic balance that we need to look at now. We can no longer look at only nuclear. That is like, you know, nuclear 2.0 rather than 4.0. And that is also not being properly addressed. I have dealt a lot with lethal autonomous weapon systems. And let me tell you, I started this whole dialogue when I was in the UN, and the difficulty is that even at the time when everyone was saying, well, we don't really deal with this, right now there is a distinct effort by a number of countries, including the US, including Russia, including Israel, including the UK, to push back against a ban on lethal autonomous weapon system. So that is something that needs to be addressed in the global strategic context of nuclear, but also disarmament and arms control.
And there's another question, so.
Hi, it's Mark Landler with the New York Times. Bill, you were talking earlier about how, you know, almost nobody believes that North Korea is going to give up its nuclear arsenal, but it remains U.S. policy that they should in a complete and verifiable and irreversible way. Is there any argument at all for the U.S. over time shifting to a deterrent strategy toward, in effect, acknowledging the reality of that? Or would that just be a terrible mistake?
No, I mean, I think, you know, that may prove inevitable over time. But I think right now, I mean, I don't take issue with the fact that that's still the formal position of the United States. The question is, you know, can you try to take advantage of this moment to make practical step-by-step progress, even if you think that that ultimate outcome is quite unlikely? And I think that's actually possible to do. But I do think it's important then to engage systematically with one another. That's the kind of thing that's rarely done when two leaders, you know, meet with one another, especially when one of them, I think, is kind of untethered in the details of the issues as well. So I don't take issue so much with the formal end state position of the United States. The question is, how realistic are you about making progress in that direction, even if that proves ultimately elusive? In which case, then, just as you suggested, you're in a better position to deter because you've managed, hopefully, to apply intrusive verification measures. There's a degree of transparency. You've walked back the program in some of its most threatening forms. You've built some confidence with our allies in the area as well. So, I don't think the situation is hopeless at all, but a lot of it's going to depend on how realistic I think we are.
With that, thank you very much to both of you for helping us. I certainly learn an awful lot, and if the first step to this is raised awareness, and I think hopefully we've done a little bit of that today. Thank you to our audience. Thank you, Bill Burns, Angela Kane, for this issue briefing.
Thank you.
Thanks.